Hello, my name is Emma and this channel is all about sewing, mainly hand sewing. And today I've got a video packed full of information for you, all about binding. Now, I knew I had some projects coming up that needed binding, so I asked on Instagram if you'd be interested in watching a video about binding and what you'd like to know about binding. And these are all the things that came back, lots of questions and suggestions, so thank you for that. So I hope I'm going to address all of them today in this video and show you my really easy binding method, how to do it by machine, and also some hand stitch options as well. So one of the projects that I've been working on this week is making design boards. I have a class coming up on miniature English paper piece patchwork that I'm teaching here in the studio, and I wanted to make design boards so the participants could use them while they're here to lay their pieces out and to work from them. Now, I'm mentioning this in this video because I wanted to sew the binding onto the design boards. Spoiler alert, that was a big mistake. I had seen someone do it on YouTube and I thought that it would be a good idea. So I bought the foam core board, I cut it into 16-inch square pieces because that was the size that I wanted to give everybody. And I experimented with different widths of binding strips. I settled on 3-inch binding strips. I prepared those by cutting the strips and sewing them together at right angles and trimming off the excess, so there was a really nice diagonal join for the strips, and I used my scraps to make the binding strips. It's a really nice way of using up scraps. I put wadding on the foam core board and then used my very easy binding method to add the binding to the design board. And it was all going well. I thought my machine might be able to cope with it because it is a semi-industrial straight stitch only machine. And it did. It worked for about 3, and then epic fail. I broke a needle. Please don't ever try that. 10 out of 10 don't recommend sewing through that, even with a tough machine. Yeah. So I tried the hot glue method that Laurie Holt does. And again, varying degrees of success there, a bit messy, not as clean as I wanted it to be. So back to the drawing board, I've got my backup machine here, and I'm going to show you another method that I'm doing for making the design boards, which is completely sewn. Then I'll show you my really easy binding method as I sew the binding onto them. And I'll show you how I apply it by machine, how I stitch it down by machine as well. And I will also show you some hand stitching of the binding down as well, because I had some requests for that as well. So let's make some design boards. I'd just like to take a minute to say a huge thank you to Serious Readers for sponsoring today's video. And here in front of me I have my Serious Light. This is the high definition cordless tabletop model. So it's really portable. I can charge it up and then pick it up and put it wherever I need it, which is ideal in this space. I can move it to different parts of the studio, and it's really handy to have at home as well. Perhaps you want a light in your sewing space, but then also you have somewhere else where you might read. You can pick it up and move it to wherever you need it in the house. So I really love that about this light. Also, I really love the daylight wavelength technology. And you can see, even though it's daytime while I'm filming, just how bright that light is. And it isn't a light that blinds you and feels uncomfortable on your eyes. It's a light that feels really relaxing because the daylight wavelength technology replicates the daylight spectrum as closely as technically possible. So it creates this natural feeling light which is really restful on the eyes and really helps me to work for longer periods of time because it reduces eye strain. If you'd like to find out more about the Serious Lights range, then I'll leave a link in the description box below, and my offer code is Emma24. So if you were to purchase a light, do use that code because that will give you £100 off a high definition light and also free delivery. So thank you so much to Serious Readers for sponsoring today's video. I am using Legacy Flex Foam double-sided fusible foam, and you can sew through this. This is the foam that I use in a lot of my patterns, my sewing cases and baskets and things like that use foam like this that you can sew through, and there's never any issue. It doesn't cause any problems to your machine. It's designed to be sewn through. So I'm cutting 16-inch square pieces, and instead of wadding, because I was finding the wadding just didn't seem as durable as I wanted it to be, I'm fusing felt to it. It's a wool felt, wool acrylic blend. I'm actually doing it to the back and the front. Now, all of these things cost more than wadding and foam core board, but my thoughts behind it are that I'm using them here in the studio for when people come to classes, and I want them to be durable and to last. So even though I know this is a more expensive way of making them, I'm hoping that they're going to be really durable and last. So what I did was cut the 16-inch square felt and foam, and I put it in my heat press, which was a previously gifted item, but I'm not sponsored or anything by that company. It's just, that's what I use to fuse it. It's quite handy, but you can use an iron. And now I'm ready to add the binding around the edge. So let me show you how I do that. So once I've prepared my binding strips, as I showed you at the beginning of the video, by cutting 3.5-inch strips, sewing them together at right angles, pressing it in half. What I do when I've cut the foam and everything is line up the strip. I always start about halfway down one side, and I actually start with it opened out, and I fold one side in a diagonal like so. And the reason why I do this is I start sewing here, and I sew down about 1.5 to 2 inches, and then I lift the needle up and the presser foot, and then I fold the other part of the binding over and then continue sewing. And the reason for doing this is because when it comes back around to having the end, you can pop the end in there and it makes a really nice finish. I find this to be a really easy way of doing it because you don't have to worry about joining the two ends together. I just pop the other end in here, and I will show you exactly how I do that at the machine. So I've positioned the binding along the edge of the piece, and I would do this even if it was a quilt. It makes no difference that this actually isn't a quilt. And I'm going to start stitching down that line. And I'm using a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and I've got to this point and I'm just going to lift up the needle, lift up the presser foot, pull it out, and then fold it back over, keeping everything neat, and then go back under and continue stitching all the way down here. And what that's done is create a little opening here, and we'll see that when we get back round to the beginning again, and I'll show you what we do with our end. But for now, we're going to continue stitching along until we get to the corner, and I'll show you how to do mitered corners. So when I get to the corner, I am stopping when my needle is in line with the corner point. So you can see that when I just pull it back a little bit, my needle is in line with the corner. So what I need to do now is lift up the presser foot, and I turn the piece. When I've still got the needle down, I turn it, so I'm now going to sew off the edge in line with the corner. So I need to put my presser foot back down and just sew off that corner. Now I'm going to lift the presser foot up, but I'm going to keep the needle down. And what I need to do now is fold the binding back, and I'm just going to finger press it in a diagonal in line with the corner, and then reposition it straight again here. So now what I do, my thread is still attached, I'm not moving it or fastening it off. I've folded the binding back just to create a diagonal in line with the point, and then folded it down so I've got a folded edge along this top edge, and the raw edge now lines up with the edge I'm going to sew along next. Just get it nice and straight, and then I put that back under the presser foot. I'll put my presser foot down and I'll just lift my needle up, slide it under ever so slightly so I'm still at the very beginning point, put my needle down, and I'm ready now to sew along this edge. Come to the corner again, so I lift up, I turn it, I put the presser foot down, I stitch off the edge, lift the presser foot up, bring it round, fold the binding back to make a diagonal, fold it straight again, keep everything nice and straight. Lining up the raw edges, put it back under the presser foot, lift the needle up, get it really under the presser foot, needle down in the corner, and off we go again. So I'm going to repeat this for the other two corners, and then I'll meet you back where we started and I'll show you how we put the end inside the little opening we made. Now I'm just stitching down this edge and I'm almost back where I started, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my piece nice and flat here and I'm just going to push it into the opening that we created before, and I think I'm just going to trim a little bit off as well just to make sure it all sits nice and flat. And now what I'm going to do is just stitch all the way down here and just overlap my stitches a little bit that I did before. And when you see on the other side, everything's nice and flat and straight, and you can just fold it over, and everything is joint. I mean, there's a little bit of an opening. You could stitch that shut by just stitching over it if you wanted to, but I've never found it to be a problem. Now the corners, because we did our mitre corner, when you turn it the right side out, you've got this nice diagonal on each one. And now I'm going to give everything a really good press. A common step that people forget when binding quilts is the pressing stage. So I always press the binding nice and flat on the side I've stitched it down on, and then on the side that I'm working on, I just press it into position. And then I'll use some binding clips to hold it in place. I think the pressing stage is really key to getting a really nice neat finish, so don't skip this stage if you're doing it on a quilt, I especially, but for these boards it's just worth taking that time. It just makes everything lie flatter and seem neater. So I'm going to spend some time now pressing and clipping, and I'll show you what it looks like after. So everything's roughly clipped in place. I've made the mitre corners by folding them over. It's really easy to do because of how we stitched the other side. So now we're ready to take it to the machine. I'm going to show you how I'm machine stitching it down, which isn't what I would do for a quilt. I would always hand stitch this down, but I will show you that on the next one I make. So I am using a 3.5 length stitch to do the top stitching, and I'm just lining it up with the presser foot along the edge of the binding so I get the stitches a nice distance away from the binding, and that's it. I'm just going to follow it round. I'm not using a top stitching thread, I'm just using the same thread as I did for the piecing. When you get to the corner, you could stitch up the diagonal if you want to. I'm not going to, I'm just going to stitch across, turn my work and stitch down the other end again. Just as simple as that. So now I'm going to stitch the binding down by hand. There are just a few things that I need. I need my scissors. I'm using a milliner's size 10 big eye needle. The ones I'm using are made by Tulip, I really like these. I'm using Wonderful Deco Bob thread, it's an 80 weight polyester thread, and I need a thimble for doing this. And this first stitch that I'm showing you is how to stitch it down in an almost invisible way. That's why we're using the Wonderful Deco Bob thread. So first I'm going to bury my thread tail. So I'm going to go in about 1/2 inch away from where I want to begin my thread, bring my needle up where I want to start and pull through. Now you can see there's my thread tail. So I'm just going to pull the thread until it disappears, the tail disappears. And then I'm going to just do another stitch at that point. And now I'm ready to sew along. So all I'm doing here now is I'm going to put my needle back in directly opposite where I came out in the binding, but I'm going to go back into the quilt, if you like, let's call it a quilt. Bring it out a stitch length in front into the binding, just in the very edge, push through like so. And then just repeat that, so I'm going down into the quilt directly opposite where I've come out in the binding. Go forward diagonally a stitch length to bring it out in the binding, push through. Keep that going down into the quilt, across, up through the binding. When you make your stitches like this, the longest part of the stitch is actually running underneath everything, which is why you can barely see the stitches when you sew like this. They're so tiny on the top, but they do their longest part underneath, and that's what makes it a really good stitch. It's what we do for, it's exactly what you'd do for applique. So just going across, coming out all the way along. Now I'll keep stitching so you can really, I know people wanted to see this in extreme detail. I'm almost at the corner, and then I'll show you what I do when I get to the corners. Now we've got our diagonal fold at the corner here for our mitered corner, so I'm going to remove the clip. Now I could just stitch down here and this would be fine, but I actually always stitch this bit as well. So I'm just bringing my needle up. So bring my needle up here, and I'm just going to bring it down in this side of the binding right there. And quickly just fit one more on right at the top. And now I'm going to turn the work, so I'm ready to go in this direction. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the needle back in here, because this is where my thread is at the moment, coming out there. And I want to start stitching here, so I'm just going to run the needle through just the top layer. All the while I'm doing this, I'm only going through the top layer. I'm not going anywhere near through to the back at all. I'm just going to bring the needle out here, ready to start stitching in exactly the same way along here. So that's how we stitch it down by hand, using like an invisible stitch almost. Now I'll show you some decorative stitch ideas. So to do my decorative stitches, I'm using Wonderful Fruity, which is a 12 weight cotton. I use this for hand quilting. It has variegation in the colours, which is why I like it, but 12 weight is a good weight of thread for hand quilting and decorative stitches. And I'm using a chenille 24 needle, and the ones that I like are the ones made by Tulip. Put a knot in the end of my thread, and as I did before, I'm going to bury the tail a distance away from where I want to begin. Just pull so the knot goes inside, and if a little bit of the tail is still poking out like it is here, you can just snip that off. I just need to pull it up a little bit. Snip, and then we're ready. So, really nice one to do, and again I need my thimble for doing these stitches because I use this finger a lot to push the needle in and out. So a really nice one to do first of all is a really nice running stitch, just keeping. Now when doing decorative stitches, it can be tempting to go through too many layers, so do bear it in mind that you do really only want to go through binding in your first layer. So I'm just doing some little running stitches which can look really nice, and doing them just on the edge of the binding. And doing them just at the edge of the binding just really keeps everything in place. Now, one thing that's a really nice little, very subtle touch is maybe to add a little cross stitch in between your running stitches. So you can do it where you do the cross stitch every, say, 5 stitches or 6 stitches, you pick a number there, or you can do it just randomly. So that's really what I've been doing. So my needles come out as if ready to make the next running stitch, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring it up diagonally to here, go through the top layer, but bring it out in line with where I came out originally, pull through, and then just cross it over there, and then go through a stitch length, and go through a stitch length there. So I've got my little cross, it's quite tiny, that one, and I'm ready to carry on doing my running stitches. So I'll show you that again. sewing stitch, as simple as it is, it looks really nice. It sort of echoes hand quilting, so I think that's a really, really nice one to do. So let's try a different stitch. So the next stitch I'm going to show you is really nice for stitching on quilt binding. I'm going to do it quite big, but you can alter the size and do it however you want it to be. But it's good for quilt binding because you're going into the binding and then into the quilt back itself, or the front, whichever way you're stitching it on. So it's a herringbone stitch. Now I'm stitching it in this direction from left to right, so that's different to how I've been stitching everything so far, but it's just worth noting that. So come up in your quilt and then go down diagonally in front in your binding, go down and then up a stitch length like so. It creates a diagonal stitch like this, and then you're just going to go down into your quilt again in and out a stitch length, and it makes this lovely crossover pattern. So the key is just trying to get them consistent. It just takes a bit of practice, but it's just a really simple, lovely one, and it's very fast as well. Really securely attaches the binding on, and it's just really nice. I really enjoy doing this one, so give this one a go. So there are definitely some differences between the two types of design boards that I've made today. So with the one with the foam board, it's much more rigid and it's not as soft and pliable as this one is. So in that respect, this one is a bit better, but this one will still do the job fine for what I need it for in here, I'm sure. I have found that putting the wadding on does hold the pieces on a bit better than the felt does, so that's something to bear in mind too. I think the felt is more durable long term, but the wadding helps the pieces to stick better. So it really just does depend on what you want to do when you make your boards, but I hope you like seeing both ways, and obviously some of the things that went well and some of the things that didn't go well. Thank you so much for watching today's video, and I'll see you really soon in the next one. Take care. Bye bye.